Hello, everyone. I see attendees are still kind of filtering in. I'm going to start my introductions here, and we'll just let people continue to filter in and get this event started. Welcome, everyone, to this Montana Book Festival event featuring, I know, everyone's favorite Missoula-based novelists, Deirdre McNamer, Carolyn Patterson, and Gwen Florio. This is Montana Mysteries 3 Ways. Before I forget to mention it, though, I want to mention something, and that is that Carolyn Patterson is celebrating a birthday today. And so I just want to wish Carolyn a very happy birthday. I knew that I would forget if I didn't mention it right off the top. So everyone wish Carolyn a very happy birthday in the chat. I want to thank our event sponsors today, Arts Missoula, the Whitefish Review, and Betty's Divine. I am zooming in from my office in the Mountain Press Publishing Company building here in Missoula, Montana. And if you want, along with birthday greetings, I urge you to tell us where you are zooming in from. Just pop your location into the chat at the bottom of your screen. The Montana Book Festival acknowledges that we are in the Aboriginal territories of the Salish and Kalispel people. The name Missoula comes from a Bitterroot Salish word in Misuletko, which means place of freezing water. This name has been used for over 12,000 years since the existence of glacial Lake Missoula. The first Europeans who came here borrowed the Salish term in Misuletko and modified the word to Missoula. Later, when glacial Lake Missoula melted, the Bitterroot Salish began using an additional term for Missoula, which means place of the small bull trout. In 1855, the Bitterroot Salish were forced to sign the Hellgate Treaty. Following this treaty, the United States government carried out forced assimilation, removal, and genocide against the Salish and other peoples in their efforts to acquire land. Yet despite centuries of colonial theft and oppression, the Tutayoken people are still here and thriving on their Aboriginal lands. The Montana Book Festival strives, and we will continue to strive to help promote Indigenous voices as one of the ways our organization acknowledges and respects the Aboriginal peoples of Missoula. A few logistics before I introduce tonight's guests of honor, our authors. I'd like to welcome you as attendees to submit your questions to Dee, Gwen, and Carolyn via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. We will be kind of taking your questions throughout the hour. I'm actually going to stay on screen and interject occasionally with your questions, so do feel free to throw those into the Q&A when you have them. Feel free to use the chat function, which you'll notice is separate from the Q&A. You can use the chat function like you've been doing to throw those birthday greetings into the chat, or any logistical questions you might have for us. On the back end, Barbie Beaton, one of our volunteers, and I will be throwing links into the chat to purchase these books, these really wonderful mysteries from Fact and Fiction. So that chat, welcome. You can be as active as you want on it. And now for the main event, I want to introduce the authors we are here to celebrate tonight. Deirdre McNamer, or Dee, is the author of 5 novels: Aviary, Rima in the Weeds, One Sweet Quarrel, My Russian, and Red Rover, which was a winner of the Montana Book Award and was named a Best Book of the Year by Artforum, The Washington Post, and The Los Angeles Times. Her essays, short fiction, and reviews have appeared in The New Yorker, Plowshares, The New York Times, and Outside, among other venues. She has taught writing at Cornell University, Williams College, Ohio State University, the University of Oregon, the University of Alabama, the University of Montana, and the Bennington Writing Seminars, where she currently teaches in the Low Residency MFA program. She lives here in Missoula, Montana. Welcome, Dee.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Carolyn Patterson is the author of Ballet at the Moose Lodge and 2 children's books on the natural world. She edited the literary anthology Montana Women Writers, A Geography of the Heart. Her short fiction and essays have been published in journals including Epoch, Outside, Southwest Review, and 17, and have been included in anthologies including A Million Acres, Montana Noir, Bright Bones, and The New Montana Story. She is currently the executive director of the Missoula Writing Collaborative, which places creative writing teachers in more than 34 elementary school classrooms in rural, urban, and reservation schools across Western Montana. She lives with her husband, writer Fred Hafley, in the Missoula home her great-grandfather built in 1906. Her 2 grown children visit on Sundays for dinner and laundry. Welcome, Carolyn, and happy birthday. Gwen Florio is the author of the Lola Wicks crime series, the Nora Best Mysteries and Silent Hearts, a standalone novel set in Afghanistan. A longtime journalist, she won the Pinkley Prize for debut crime fiction and a High Plains Book Award for her first novel, Montana. Gwen lives here in Missoula, Montana. Welcome, Gwen.
Hi. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. I am going to throw things over to you. Did we lose Carolyn? Oh, there she is.
There she is.
There she is. Okay, I'm going to throw things over to you. I will mute my mic, but stay on board for questions that come our way, okay?
So we decided, just in talking a little bit about this yesterday, that we would each describe our books very briefly and read a short excerpt. And then after that, maybe make a comment or two about what the excerpt does in the book, or why you read it, and what kind of an element it is in the larger book. So maybe you could start, Gwen.
Hold on.
Oh, there you go.
Now I'm ready. Okay. So I'm going to read from Best Kept Secrets, which is the second book in my Nora Best series, which is about a woman who goes on the run towing her Airstream trailer behind her. In this book, Nora is fleeing just a terrible experience in the wilds of Wyoming, and she has gone home to her childhood home on Maryland's eastern shore to visit with her widowed mother and kind of rest and recuperate. And that home is this large pre-revolutionary home on the banks of a river, the sorts of things you find in that part of the world. And what I'm going to read is a description of that house, which is called Quail House. It was one of the earliest of the grand old homes that staked out the prime riverbank land. Its owner was one of the few who turned his back on the loamy earth that enriched his neighbors, who planted tobacco and later corn and soybeans, and instead turned to the river and the bay beyond, making his fortune from shooting geese from the sky by the thousands, pulling rockfish and blue crabs from the bay. Generations of Black women trooped into the series of Quonset huts at one end of town, where they sat at long metal tables, extracting the sweet meat from crab shells and packing it into tins stamped with the colonial-style lettering of Smith's Best Backfin Crab. The house was miles from the grubby reminders of what funded it, a stair-step brick edifice added onto as the Smith fortune increased. Anchored by the original single-story two-room house at one end that contained the kitchen, with a two-story addition in the middle and a final three-story L that held the sitting rooms and library necessary to people of consequence. Then I'm going to skip ahead to a couple of pages where Nora and her mother are sitting down to visit for the first time in many years. They sat in the kitchen, the oldest part of Quail House, its whitewashed brick walls 3 feet thick, keeping the heat at bay, the room cool even without the air conditioning that Nora's mother refused to install. A 6-foot wide fireplace stretched across one wall, once the room's sole source of heat, its shining brass andirons these days purely decorative, the chimney capped with tin against the incursion of winter's rainy downdrafts, spring's nesting birds, and summer's voracious insects. Copper pots hung from ceiling hooks in the kitchen. Pewter plates, flanked by candlesticks, stood along the mantel. A long table, scarred from 2 centuries and more of use, vied with the fireplace for domination of the room. Can you imagine, Penelope, that's Nora's mother, often asked, running her fingers over the gouges in the wood, their rough edges long ago sanded smooth and nearly filled with layers of furniture wax, assiduously applied over the decades, what it meant to turn this old table that they made by hand over to the kitchen help, to replace it with one shipped from Europe? How much that must have cost, how long they must have waited. The good table sat largely unused in the dining room, its reddish cherry surface dusted and polished weekly, its slender curved legs balanced on an ornate rug whose fringes brushed the baseboards, awaiting the events, holidays, luncheons, that demanded the formality highlighted by Penelope's oft-repeated recitation of Quail House's original wonders. Real glass in the windows instead of oiled parchment, silver instead of everyday pewter. A tea service gleamed from a sideboard, its teapot and the taller coffee pot arrogant as dancers, one arm akimbo, the other curving high and graceful. Unlike the dining room table, Penelope used it on occasions both special and everyday, smiling in satisfaction as she tilted the teapot over spode cups, proclaiming as though it weren't obvious, "I like pretty things," just like those early Smiths who built this place. Her tinkling laugh echoed in the clink of spoon against china. And the room, indeed, the whole house was pretty, albeit in a chilly, formal sort of way, as though preserved in some sort of colonial amber. Can you imagine, teenage Nora often thought rebelliously, the work it took to keep this house so pretty? To polish the silver by candlelight after a day of hauling water from a well, chopping wood for the fire, hoisting heavy rugs over a cord, and whacking at them with woven rattan beaters until one's arms went rubbery, chasing a squawking chicken across the yard, grabbing its scaly legs, twirling it once, twice to leave it too limp and dazed to flap away from the descending axe, to plunge one's hands into the still warm cavity and claw out the steaming guts, sink onto a bench for a brief relief, for the brief respite afforded by plucking, feathers sticking to fingers still slick with blood. Not so pretty now. And the reason I chose that passage about the house was the house will increasingly figure in the book almost as a character. The book itself revolves around the racism caused by the unacknowledged complicity of what you might think of as nice white people when they look the other way at things that are just unpleasant. They'd rather not see it, and what that sort of attitude allows to happen. And in that passage, you get a hint of how Quail House, this beautiful home, is rooted in unpleasantness. So, thank you.
Caroline?
All right. So my book is The Stone Sister, and I'm going to read my passage and then I'll talk about why I chose it. So the book is told in three voices, and the voice I'm going to read from is the kind of the contemporary voice, which is this sister who is looking for this hidden sister. And the two things that you need to know before I read is she's lost a child. She had a miscarriage when this happened. And the other thing you need to know is the Prairie-style house Elizabeth inherited from her parents was filled from basement to attic with 4 generations worth of Carter furniture, mail, knickknacks, letters, magazines, trunks, dolls, lead soldiers, cookbooks, baby buggies, and sermons. When she and Tom first moved in, she was comforted by the clutter. It was a way of summoning her parents. Her father had died 3 years ago of heart failure, sitting at the breakfast table on the morning of his June birthday, the next minute slumped over his eggs. Her mother followed a year later, complications stemming from a broken hip. Elizabeth had been comforted by the sight of her mother's army of vitamin bottles, her father's collection of World War II miniature tanks, all facing west, as if he were preparing to do battle with an army of mice. Now she hated all of it. The stuff was paralyzing, as if it buried her along with her parents, like those Egyptian kings who took their servants, horses, and armies along with them when they died. Now I'm going to skip ahead also and talk about this moment when she goes, she's doing all this house cleaning, and then she wakes up in the night. She woke consumed by panic. She climbed out of bed and crept downstairs to the kitchen, put the tea kettle on, and waited for the water to boil. She looked at the freckled formica, the stove with 2 working burners that was the height of fashion in the 1950s. Suddenly, she was shot with the loss of her parents. She missed seeing them around this table, her father with his nubby cardigan and thick glasses, her mother in her red sweater and strands of white hairs, looking up, smiling as she moved her walker across the kitchen. The house still had their sweet, slightly acrid smell of fried meat, floor wax, and furniture polish. What was that song she used to sing, Love Wanders on Every Road? She drank her mug of tea in the stillness of the kitchen. The dog barked down the street. The neighbor's bathroom light clicked on and minutes later clicked off. Weariness stole over her and then was quickly replaced by a kind of internal humming, like an engine starting up again, and she pushed herself out of the chair and walked upstairs. She climbed up the stairs to the attic, past a pair of wooden crutches and hideous portraits by a relative who was more successful in the meatpacking business. The smell of dust and moldering clothes was sharp, thick, inviting, a smell as old as imagination itself. This was the place she and Karen had played as children, dressing up in beaded gowns and leather gloves, looking at daguerreotypes of family, faces resolute as they stared up from brocade-covered albums, the aunts like black crows, the ancient-looking children, the boys in short pants, the girls in ringlets, the stern fathers with monocles and broad, unsmiling faces. This was the place the two of them came that day in May, when her mother dressed them up for the Penny's photographer, Elizabeth in her pale green top and skirt with rickrack trim, Karen in a plaid sundress. They'd found the Christmas toys their mother had bought on sale and stored them away for the next Christmas, a dollhouse with real furniture for Karen, a sad-eyed doll with long blonde hair that came with her own sleeping bag for Elizabeth. While the two of them were covered in dust and that particular timelessness associated with guilty pleasure, their mother was riding Elizabeth Schwinn around the neighborhood, frantically calling them. Then she remembered the attic. And there they were, faces smudged, dresses filthy, Karen decorating the living room of the dollhouse, and Elizabeth putting the blue riding coat on the Samantha doll and tucking her into the sleeping bag. Their parents had taken them into their bedroom and spanked them as they faced one another. At first, it seemed very funny to Elizabeth until it made her mother spank her harder. She gingerly touched a white-faced China boy doll with magenta lips that looked like something out of a nightmare. Nearby was a rack of cheap matching cardboard boxes that Elizabeth recognized as one of her mother's attempts to get organized. She unloaded the boxes from the racks and opened them, tossing the threadbare girdles, underwear with stretched out elastic, torn t-shirts into her sack, check carbons, bound together by a silver clip. As she was about to toss them in the sack, her father's handwriting stopped her. It was pinched, squarish, small, an awkward scrawl of a left-hander forced to write with the opposite hand. Each one written to the state of Montana for amounts ranging from $40 to $60. Oh God, Elizabeth thought. She remembered her father's voice, soft, his head sideways on the white pillow, the heart monitor beeping. I wasn't always good to your sister, he said. Daddy, Karen loves you, she said. No, he shook his head, his voice urgent. Listen to me. There is another Elizabeth, another sister. I always thought it was better not to tell you. Now I'm telling you. Why keep her a secret? She asked him. Her father looked at her, his eyes distant. That's what we did in those days, to protect you. Oh my God, her sister Karen wrote back. We have a sister? And then the news was lost in the chaos of grieving, settling the estate, and then her mother passed and the cycle began again. She told Ruth when they were out for a drink one night, when Ruth started to pepper her with questions. Is she still living? What's her name? Don't you want to find her? Elizabeth knew it was a mistake. I don't know, she kept saying, wishing that Ruth would stop asking her questions, wishing that she'd never brought it up. She put the checks back in the box and shut the lid. She climbed downstairs, washed her face and hands, and got into bed beside Tom, curling into his reassuring furnace-like warmth, her head on his back. She dreamt she was being chased by an invisible, dreaded pursuer, disguising herself to throw the pursuer off track, but every time this invisible being sniffed her out and was once again chasing her. So I chose that passage because I think it's kind of similar to what Gwen was saying. this was obviously a family house. Is kind of filled from basement to rafters with all this kind of family detritus, and there's literally a family secret buried in the house, and so much of the house I think the house kind of becomes a character in the book, because two characters in the story live in the house as this mystery of this missing sister becomes unraveled. So that's why I chose that passage.
And then in my novel, there's also a house of a kind, which is an apartment building for senior citizens in some place not unlike Missoula, and a fire breaks out. And so a lot of it is set in this building. It's a 4-story, 24-unit building. There's a fire breaks out in one of the apartments, which may or may not be arson, and then gradually becomes clear that it probably is. And but in the trajectory of the book, the fire actually prompts the residents of this building to engage, as I see it, with two larger dramas. So one drama is a scheme that seems to be underway to deprive them of their homes. And the other is the precarious nature of old age itself, with its insistent memories, yearnings, and physical griefs set against a clock that is ticking down fast. An eccentric fire inspector and a desperate, bullied teenager become essential parts of the story, as does a quietly growing sense that some kind of broader dislocation is in store for everyone. So that's sort of the big outline of the book. And I'm just going to read a very short section. I was going to read about something having to do with the apartment building itself, but I'm going to move across town to the home of the fire inspector, just briefly. So the fire has broken out. He gets a call, but before that happens, he wakes up in his house across the river. Across town, on the other side of the river, Chief Fire Inspector Lander Mackey heard a humming sound coming from the living room. Rhonda was up early. He pulled on some sweats and running shoes, splashed cold water on his face, waved to her, and headed out for his early morning slow run. The sky was shedding its pink lights and firming up to a frank and cloudless blue, a November blue, with a desultory wafer of moon floating near the horizon. What had Rhonda told him about some native names for the month of November? Beaver moon, goose-going moon, mad moon. Why mad? Because a November day could seem to be caught confused and blustering between the falling gold of fall and the icy crawl of winter? Maybe, but not today. Today, November was neither. It held the quietness of a pause, the feeling of a something before. A train whistle blew, a door slammed, and a car revved up. Mackey's breath smoked lightly before him. He ran slowly through the neighborhood of small and aging houses, some with pin-neat yards, others benignly shambled. Turned over trikes, clumped lawns, and rusty barbecues. There, a tipsy pink flamingo, and over there, an eave fringed with tattered prayer flags, another dangling dead flowers in a planter. A window with a Christian fish, another with a peace sign, another with a Go Grizz banner. A neighborhood of cracked sidewalks, faded, charming porches, kids, students, laborers, adjuncts, retirees, firefighters, do-gooders, many of them up early with Mackie in their lighted kitchens about to head into their days. He rounded the last corner of his short run, slowed, then sprinted the last 50 yards toward the yellow glow from his own living room. Inside, Rhonda was on her knees at the side of Siddhartha, their Great Dane, humming still and waving a glowing braided stalk of sweetgrass over the dog's head. She looked up. Sid's exhausted from his criminal adventures, she said briskly. It'll take a few minutes before he's clear. The dog stretched on his huge sheepskin bed, the herby smoke moving in lazy wreaths above the odor that emanated from him. Over in the corner, their ancient turtle came out of its shell, stared around aghast, and disappeared again. I'm with you, pal, Mackie murmured. Sid had been missing for most of the day before, and when he finally showed up, he reeked of misadventure involving unfresh carcasses and some dairy thing that was worse. They'd managed to coax him into the shower with a piece of pizza and had tried to clean him up with Rhonda's cucumber body wash, but the smell lingered and she'd gone to bed claiming further steps were needed if the entire house wasn't going to take on a negative charge, making them all a little sad once again. Siddhartha had all the big-boned amiability and sensory acuity you would expect in his breed, plus an extra degree of alertness that stemmed from whatever circumstances had deposited him thin and shaking in a glass-sharded barrow pit on the edge of town, to be discovered and rehabilitated by Rhonda. He turned out to have, as well, another trait that seemed to go beyond his breeding and history and could only be described as a certain large kindness. It was there in the way that he tipped his heavy head to fasten a liquid look of utter empathy on his humans, in the way he had risen from his sheepskin pallet on the few occasions when Mackie and Rhonda argued, and placed a paw on first one person's knee and then the other's, dissipating all unease or rancor in a matter of seconds. So I read that just to bring up a possible discussion or brief discussion about the role of sort of subsidiary characters in a book. Mackie, of course, is a main character in this book, but there's also Rhonda, his wife, and Siddhartha, the dog, actually, who play major roles ultimately, but don't seem to at first. And so I like to think about how important it is, or it is to me anyway, to create peripheral characters who have an effect on the story, which can be anything running from relief or humor, or just, being able to pay attention to something else for a while, the reader, or to underline, underscore, sort of enrich the central story. So that's why I read that. So at this point, maybe any questions among the audience so far? We would love it if you could sort of lead us in some ways, because there's lots to talk about. We realized yesterday when we were talking about, everything from placing a novel in a home or out of a home, or family secrets, what kind of mysteries there are to write about. We've all written somewhat differently about mystery itself. And so at this point, maybe somebody could ask us a question. And if not, we'll go ahead.
Yeah, we do have a question in the Q&A, and I'm going to ask it. But Dee, you brought up this idea of peripheral characters, and you spoke to a couple of yours. I'm wondering, Gwen and Carolyn, can you speak to those peripheral characters in your books and how you write them and what you believe their role to be?
Yeah, I had the experience that I've had before of a character originally meant to be sort of a peripheral character take over and become really key to the book, almost a secondary main character. She was a woman who had worked as a housekeeper in the house and had stayed on in the town. And I kept trying to tell her story through Nora's eyes and memories, and man, it was just flat. And finally, I ended up going back and telling those directly in Grace's voice, that's her name, and alternating with flashbacks, which I almost never do, and having parallel tracks. And I felt like the book just came alive then. And that's what really made it work. So you got to watch those secondary characters. They get really assertive sometimes.
Carolyn, what about for you?
You're muted, Carolyn.
I had several, because of course there's three different narratives. So one was this character Willie, who was at the Stone home, and he was a kind of high functioning special needs kid, and I love that character. He kind of helps out this character Louise Gustafson, and he's very sweet, and I don't know, he was one of those characters, kind of like you're saying, Gwen, that kind of became a much larger part of, and it was kind of a way for me to explore a special needs character, and without trying to, and it was very scary, and I was very sensitive to not wanting to do something that was that would be terrible and awful, but he was one of my favorite characters. I also had characters that were in the more contemporary section of the book that were part of this goofy progressive school that were, they were just more fun characters. And I agree. I think they're great because they kind of let you, this book was
Carolyn, you're cutting out a little bit.
Was very dark, and it was fun. Oh.
You're back, I think.
I think I'm back. Yeah, it was hard to have, it was nice to have characters that could bring different dimensions to a difficult story.
And just speaking to your character, specifically Willie, Carolyn, I mean, it seems to me that peripheral characters or secondary characters sort of act as like tools to help readers kind of understand the primary character better, right? Because in for instance, Willie, these scenes with Willie and Louise, you're actually getting to know Louise's empathy for other people and the way that she treats other people through her interactions.
Right.
And certainly same with those characters in your books, Gwen and Dee too. Through those interactions with these secondary characters, you certainly get to know the primary characters much better. We have another question regarding characters. It's from Amy Lynn. Have you ever ended up having to completely cut a character? And was that horribly painful for you as their creators, or maybe it was a relief?
Yeah, I think I have. I proceed so slowly, actually, with almost everything that I've written, that I'll go on big, long tangents and then have to cut it, actually, at some point. It's not characters so much as it is how much time and information I'm going to attach to a character. So, for instance, in Aviary, one of the characters is a woman who's sort of the alarmist in the apartment building, who some think is paranoid and a few think is maybe onto something, who is raising the alarm about this plot that, as she sees it, to, for an entity to come in and buy out the building and turn everybody out on the street. And I had pages and pages about her background at one point in this, what her young life had been, and all of that. And it just went somewhere else. I loved it. I spent a lot of time on the research, and finally it didn't matter. And I had to face that fact that her early life and all of this, everything that shaped her didn't matter. Her role was the town crier, basically. And so that's the kind of cutting I've found myself doing most of the time. I'm sure I've cut out characters here and there and in other books maybe, but it my cutting involves, to my anguish, sometimes really dumping a lot of material that I had put a lot of time into, and it's usually background material.
Gwen, Carolyn, do you have thoughts
for me, I can't think of characters I've cut so much as there was definitely a character I made, the character of the mother in this book, that I sort of chose not to, I chose deliberately to narrate this more from the point of view of the father. She definitely comes in scenes, but I chose not to tell the book from her point of view. I think, as Lauren and I talked about, I think the father played what was really kind of more traditionally a mother's role in some ways to this institutionalized child, even though, the child was institutionalized, so it was pretty distant. But also I found, like, with characters I was familiar with, I really had to expand their role and almost reimagine them as strangers. And with characters that I was imagining, they were much more fully fleshed as characters. So I think that's an interesting thing about working for me that I've learned.
Yeah, and I think much like Dee, a lot of what ends up getting cut is where I have gone off and just sort of gotten way off course. And at some point I'm like, whoa, this is not working. And it does not move this book forward. I've had to cut things. I still have a chapter I cut from an earlier book that I think is some of the strongest writing I've ever done. And I tried and tried to fit it into that book. I put it at the beginning, I put it at the end, I tried to wedge it into the middle, and it didn't work. And it's sitting in my computer someday waiting for its place. But I think it's really important to be able to do that, though. They talk about killing your babies, and that's what you got to do.
Don't kill your babies, kill your darlings.
Darling.
just clarifying.
Journalism, we kill widows.
We kill the bad babies.
So, yeah.
Craig Lancaster has asked a couple of questions, and one of them has to do with mystery. And this is, I maybe brought you guys together in hopes that was kind of a unifying force within your book. So I'd like to ask this question. How did these books reshape, as you worked through subsequent drafts? Gwen talked about giving Grace room to assert herself. Were there elements of mystery that sharpened as you went along in the process? Without asking for spoilers, of course.
Well, mine, I thought at the outset that I was going to try to write a sort of classic mystery, a whodunit in a way. I wanted to see if I could do it, if I could drop the clues in an interesting sort of way and solve solve who did it at the end. And that stayed for quite a while, but ultimately I realized I'm not very good at that. It's like I'm not great at figuring out all the puzzles of a classical mystery. I kept it going in a way, but what happened with me in this book was that I became more interested in other kinds of mysteries than who set the fire. I finally myself didn't care too much about who set the fire. I started, as I spent an enormous amount of time with these characters, I mean, the years on this book on and off, I just found myself being much more interested in sort of existential mysteries, I guess. You know, why are we here? What are we doing? What did that mean? You know, and I happen to think that old age is a highly dramatic time of life that is very diligently other people try to mute in some way. You know, oh, they're just, you know, oh, they've lived their life, so on. Well, actually, you're on the kind of last precipice and looking back on choices that you have made and what do they mean for you. And I just think that that's incredibly dramatic. And and that dovetailed with the concern I have about the larger society trying to make old people irrelevant or being willing to do that. And so that sort of took over in my case for the mystery. I mean, I did solve the mystery, but I finally didn't care about that part of it very much by the end of it. I cared about what happened to these characters that I'd come to know fairly well over a period of years, I felt. And the mysteries that were important to me by the end were the mystery of, I guess, human existence almost, you know, like this short time we have relatively, and what are we supposed to be doing with it? And, or what does it mean to feel irrelevant after 8 decades of your life? So anyway, it and that became all kind of daunting to try to deal with, because I'm certainly not going to solve those problems in any, you know, really scrutable way. But they just took over my concerns more. So I had a funny experience with the book. It turned out being, I hope, without planning, it turned out to be a different kind of book than I set out to write.
Gwen,
There
Carolyn.
goes your kitty cat, Carolyn.
Your cat is given a big cameo tonight, Carolyn.
Yeah, she's really prancing around.
Do
She
Gwen or
knows.
Carolyn have an answer to that? Yeah.
Gwen, do you want to go?
But Carolyn's book, for example, is really a kind of obvious mystery. It's like what went into a series of decisions, as I see it. And as Carolyn has said, it's a quest book. Like, why were these decisions made, and what do they mean for the main character ultimately? Is that your take on it, Carolyn?
I mean, I love, you know, for me, you know, that I think I so admire mystery writers for, I guess when I was working on the book, I knew what I wanted to write. You know, I wanted these 3 characters, and I knew that I wanted definitely this quest story of a sister looking for a sister. But, you know, kind of like you were, and I wanted that, I needed the arc of that tension through the story, the really hard part. And I was like, why did I choose this incredibly hard for a first novel, was to thread through this arc. To talk to you about, you know, old age, that really, when I researched this book, somebody asked, was this based on a family story? It was loosely based on a family story, but a lot of it was true. I have an older sister that was kind of disappeared. She has the same name that I do. And so I did a lot of research at the hospital and in the newspapers. And that was a mystery that, I mean, just fascinated me was, you know, so I would have a record of her being born, and then there was no record of, at the time they used to, report who went into the hospital. Can you imagine doing this now? Who went into the hospital and then who came out of the hospital in the newspaper. And, so I could see a record of her going into the hospital, and then there was no record of her coming out of the hospital. So she was like disappeared right from the start. And I was like, there's like so much collusion on a societal level for a child like that. That to me was like a larger mystery. Like, who decided that? I mean, it was, and who made all those decisions? Why did we decide that? Why did we decide in the 1910, whenever, that we had to put all these children away? I mean, I have epilepsy, and I would have been institutionalized in the night, earlier in the 40s or 30s. I mean, it was a very harsh time, and but on a structural level, the mystery, for me, was a way of giving tension to the book. There was a point in the book when I tried to group all these stories, and it was like thud, thud, thud. There was no tension at all, and I had to go back and really, give that story more of an arc, so that at least I hope there's more tension reading it.
And I would say I make things a lot harder on myself by not starting my mysteries as mysteries. I think of either an issue I want to explore or a place I'd like to write about. And then I think, what could happen there that would turn this into a mystery story? So it's really, really inefficient to do it that way. And once I figure that out, then I have to go back and use that structure. And structure is really your friend. It really helps me as I'm writing. It's like, okay, I'm at page 50 and nothing's really happened, beyond we've got a dead person over here. You got to ramp up the tension, and you got to do it again by page 100. I think that's helpful. I've learned that I'm a horrible criminal because it's hard to either kill someone or commit a very dastardly crime that would make someone invest in finding out what happened in a way it's not immediately apparent who did it, or it's so mysterious it'll never be solved. So I spend a lot of time, trying to figure out these things and then write about them. Yeah.
When you mentioned structure, how my chair is really squeaky. You mentioned structure and how that's so important to your writing process. Do you three outline your novels when you're, or did you outline these 3 novels? Did you? I'm going to take that as a no, Gwen.
I keep meaning to outline. It sounds like such a great idea when I'm in the middle of the book and I don't know what's happening next. I'm like, if only I had an outline that would tell me. And I sort of now, as I'm going along, will write a couple, 2 or 3 sentences about what happens in the next few chapters. So at least I know that far ahead. I always know, not always, but almost always know the beginning and the end. That monster middle part is just dreadful. But maybe someday I will outline. It sounds wonderful.
I think there's a great Edith Wharton quote about what is it? The beginning is like opening the door in a beautiful house, and the end is a walk in a spring wood, and the middle is the Gobi Desert. Something like that.
I go back and forth. It's so anxiety producing to just be, as Alice Munro, I think, said that a lot of her writing was just, she felt like she was walking down a hall in the dark and just feeling for the walls with her fingertips. And so you're kind of proceeding instinctively, blindly. And then that creates, at least in me, so much anxiety that I have to, I do make a provisional outline. It's always provisional. And then I feel very pleased with myself and try to proceed and do my words and all of that. And then it inevitably runs off the rails and again, and I have a certain relief when that does happen, because I do feel that anybody who thinks that they can make up things and expect people to read them without feeling anxious about writing, the writing part, is kidding themselves. Maybe there are people who just function very, efficiently and engineer books, but they're probably not the kind of books that I want to read. Finally, I like a sense of a kind of headlong quality every now and then in a book. I want to feel that the writer is a little out of control. I like that when I'm reading, it makes me nervous even to read it, but it makes me very alert to what's going on in the book. So I don't see any particular value in a kind of mathematical outline. But I think that psychologically for the writer, at least in my case, it can help sometimes. You go, well, I have some order to this. And then until you don't, again.
I used to have something called the fourth chapter syndrome. So, you write your first one, you're full of, kiss and vinegar until you get to, I think it's like 100 pages out or fourth chapter. And then you're like, oh my God, it really is like the Gobi Desert. And you're like, what am I doing? And I think that's kind of when I started to outline, kind of what you're saying, being like a provisional outline, but it's like, a sentence, a chapter or something.
It kind of helps me sometimes to just, rather than outline, just pose a series of questions. I think like what Gwen was talking about, which is, what if this? What if that? What if he turned out to have a secret first marriage? What if, just lots of, just posit some developments. And that for me creates a bit of a sense of order and calmness, but also kind of fans out into, helps you think of the possibilities of the plot, I think. What if? And I don't know, it just seems a little kinder somehow than assigning yourself a hard and fast outline.
Jackson Parker is asking, what has writing mystery taught you about storytelling and the craft of writing? Has it changed your relationship to drama and or taught you anything about yourselves?
Great question.
Yeah.
I'm pondering here. The thing I love about mystery is you can look at so many different issues. I think many books not classified as mystery could be. There's a mystery at the heart of them. There's a deep, dark question at the heart of them. And I love the way you can look at society through the lens of mystery. I think so many writers do it really well. And if you ask me who, my brain is going to go blank. But, the book's right here, dealing with old age, looking at how we treated disabled people back in the day. Those are huge. And I like to, in my own books, I like to think that I'm sneaking issues in the guise of entertainment. They would be really boring if I just wrote them, as say newspaper stories like I used to do, which I hope weren't boring, but I have a lot more fun doing it this way. So that's a rambling answer, but that's what it's done for me. And the more I do it, the more I enjoy it.
Well, actually, having been a journalist also at some previous point in my life, you're saying what happened and, laying it out. And I think that that's extremely valuable work. And, Gwen is a first-rate journalist, but what you get to do with adding mystery in, I think, is just give legitimacy to the question of why are people doing this? Why prompt somebody to behave this way? And you can't actually write a news story and, make that the centerpiece. It's just they did this and people reacted in this way, and here are the facts and that underline the decision. But a kind of overt probing of motive doesn't really happen and probably shouldn't in journalism. But it is a relief to get to go into that. It was for me anyway, to get focus on that.
And I think there's, just like you guys are saying, there's mystery in terms of like plot or in terms of not knowing something happened, but the real mystery is in human character and the human heart, and that, I think that's what is so that's what's so fun to explore, and is life changing. And I think it's just like writing characters, characters who are good, characters who are evil. I mean, for me, writing about people who had to make this decision in this really hard time was very, I'm glad I didn't. It was very, I just think it would have been a horrible decision to have made. And it gave me a lot of compassion for my parents, having made it. I guess that's one thing I think mysteries can do. They kind of put you in someone else's skin for a while, whether it's, as like Gwen's doing as an entertainment, or as, in all kinds of, or whether you're entering another character, you can enter the mysteries of another human psyche.
And I think that it's a reassurance to readers sometimes to go, oh, this is a mystery of a kind, from the outset, because then the message from the writer is there is something to be found out here,
Right.
Keep reading. It's a propulsive device, actually, which is really necessary, is to offer that promise, I think, early on, that there is we're kind of sleuths together, the writer and the reader, and let's go into this realm and see what we can discover. So that's sort of a broad definition of mystery, but I think that just strategically, it's a good idea to plant some kind of mystery at the front end of a book. And I guess what we've all said is that the range or the definition of the mystery can be very broad, but keep reading.
For me, stuff with a family's, this novel sort of based loosely on a family secret. It helped me to kind of understand this was a quest story, to understand there was sort of a shape of it, and that, because I think I felt a lot of guilt about it, and, working with this material. And once I kind of realized that, I thought, oh, I felt kind of better about working with that, because, there's a lot of history to quest story, and the hero always comes home and has learned something about themselves that they bring back to the homeland, right?
My husband's coming. I'm in the middle of his Zoom here.
There's a lot of that going on.
Darn husbands. There's a question about humor in the Q&A that I'm really, really curious about. Do the three of you
is right by the door
to break tension? And if so, how do you find ways to include that?
Hang on.
And I should say that we're at the 7:00 mark, so this might be our last question, unless the three of you have any pressing questions you want to ask one another.
Yeah, just a quick second from you.
I'll jump in. I try to put humor in my books just because they're dark. You know, someone's been killed, something bad has happened. It can be kind of exhausting and relentless if you don't give the reader a break every so often. I frequently do it with animals. They can be frustrating, they can be funny, they can get in the way in ways that you wish they wouldn't. If they're my dog, they eat things that they shouldn't, like everything. Like a very nice rug that I brought back from Pakistan just got destroyed. You know, so that's one way. The other way is I put my protagonist in situations where they are just damned incompetent. You know, I send my city girl off into the woods and she doesn't even know how to light a fire. She doesn't, you know, she's got to learn all these things. And that just kind of breaks it up a little bit. And I throw a lot about food in my books just because I'm obsessed with food. So
humor for me is it's a very important kind of release. It's very serious to me in some ways. It's I feel that sometimes if you can laugh with someone in a hard situation, that just opens it up and forges a bond. And so I try to do versions of that in the way that I construct a story, is to allow for that to come in. I think that it's a mistake to think that that humor undermines the seriousness of what you're writing about. I think it only intensifies it.
And I would add that I think that it's really important I think it adds to the emotional range of your writing. I think it's hugely important. And I guess it's also the way, I mean, I love humor and I like including it in my work, but I also think that some of the pieces that I've read that have the most impact on me have that wide range between things that are really funny and things that are really tragic in the same piece.
Do the three of you have any questions you want to pose to each other before we kind of cap off the night? I would love to hear those if you do have them. Or everyone here would love to hear those if you do have them.
Lauren, you cut out for a second, at least for me, so I missed the question.
Oh, I was just wondering if the three of you had questions for one another, if you're itching to ask any of your own questions in this space.
I don't think I haven't. I just want to say that it's been such a delight for me just to read Carolyn's book and Gwen's work. I read some of the early books, and to see where you've gone over the years since 2013 Montana came out, and I just found it really heartening to do the reading. I think we have different sensibilities and different interests and different skills, but I just want to say how much I appreciate your work, really. And Carolyn, in your case, the risk that you took, I really want a big nod to that. What a hard book to think about writing and to write, and I think that you did it really elegantly. So good on you, girl.
Oh, thank you.
And
Hey,
Carolyn, before you,
this is such an honor. What's that?
Before you joined the discussion earlier, before we started our panel, Carolyn, I was saying it's so hard when you've got a book that is so thoroughly grounded in fact to thread the needle into fiction the way you did and make it work. And
thank
so the
you.
whole time I was reading, I was just in awe of that. The other
Oh.
thing for me is that I have read your work and Dee's work long before I moved to Montana. So to be on a panel with the two of you, it's wonderful.
Well, I feel the same way. This was so much fun. I'm so honored to be with you guys. I feel like we could just talk and talk, and I know the hour is up, but this was so rich and fun, and I hope we do it over a glass of wine.
I was just going to say the same thing. So I think that's going to happen, clearly.
For sure.
Lauren, thank you for
Yes,
you
Lauren.
and everyone at the book festival for doing such a
Thank
hard
you,
task
Laura.
given.
Of course.
This was such a great topic.
Yeah, I mean, so for the audience members out there, my original pitch to Carolyn, Dee, and Gwen was like, let's just like do this like 3 Missoula powerhouses, and they were like, no. We need something a little bit more pointed than that. But you were talking of, at the very beginning of this conversation, you were talking about like houses and the structure, and I'm like, oh, the power of houses. We could have totally used that title. But something, and I just want to say this before I give my ending and my goodbye spiel. I feel like something that the 3 of you do so delicately and gracefully in your work is sort of bring out empathy, because I think in all of your novels, there's this idea of neglect, this idea that you are, neglecting the elderly, you are neglecting the disabled. In Gwen, often it's like a neglect of a crime, someone like willingly neglecting something. And I think that, at least as I've read your books, I think that you really beautifully point to like the power of empathy. So I just thank you for that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, so I'm going to now just launch into my spiel. I want to thank you 3, Dee, Carolyn, and Gwen, for joining us tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you to the audience for being a very active part of this conversation. And thank you to our event sponsors, Arts Missoula, Whitefish Review, and Betty's Divine. Just as a reminder, I know that we were throwing out links to fact and fiction books, so you can buy these novels. I really encourage you to do so. When you are checking out at factandfictionbooks.com or in person, please use the code MBF. 20% of those sales will come back to the festival. So we're so grateful to Fact and Fiction for partnering with us in this way. And I also urge you to buy Montana Book Festival merchandise, montanabookfestival.com. You can support us that way, or you can also donate directly at that website too. So thank you everyone tonight. And I wish you a really wonderful evening, and happy birthday again, Carolyn.
Yes, go have a party, Carolyn.
With my cat.
Happy birthday.
Cat, yeah. Your cat wants a party.
Yeah, he does.